Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Chapter 23, The Fourth Personal Sojourn of Beelzebub on the Planet Earth. Beelzebub continued thus. I descended for the fourth time to that planet Earth, owing to the request of my essence friend, Gornahur Harhark. I must first of all tell you that after I had met this Gornahur Harhark, and had become friendly with him, I always, during our subjective exchange of opinions, whenever we again met, shared my impressions with him about the strange psyche of the three-centered beings of that planet of yours. And the result of these exchanges of opinion of ours concerning your favorites was that he finally also became so interested in them that he once even very seriously asked me to keep him always informed, even if only approximately, of my observations of them, and thereafter I sent to him, just as I did to your uncle Tuilan, copies of all my brief notes concerning the strange particularities of their psyche. And how Gornahur Harhark came to be the cause of this descent of mine ensued from the following. I have already told you that after my third personal descent to your planet, I occasionally, for a rest, ascended to the planet Saturn to this friend of mine. When, during these flights to him, I had become convinced of his great learning, the idea once arose in me to invite him to descend on our ship occasion to the planet Mars, in order there on the spot to help me personally with his knowledge in the details of arranging my observatory, which was just then being completed. Here I might as well emphasize the fact that if this observatory of mine afterwards became famous, and indeed the best of all the constructions of its kind in the whole of the universe, I am chiefly indebted to the learning of this same essence friend of mine. Well then, when I spoke to Gornahur Harhark about this, he, without thinking long about it, agreed, and together we immediately began to deliberate how to carry out our intention. The problem was that our route from the planet Saturn to the planet Mars would cross such cosmic spheres as did not correspond to the presence of Gornahur Harhark, a being who had as yet the possibilities only for an ordinary planetary existence. The result of our deliberations, then, was that on the following day his chief assistant began, under his direction, to arrange a special compartment in our ship, Occasion, itself, and to furnish it with every kind of adaptation and apparatus for elaborating those substances of which the atmosphere of the planet Saturn consists, and to which Gornahur Harhark was adapted by nature for existence. When all these preparations had been completed, we, one Herkherhu later, set out on our journey in the direction of the planet Mars, and descended there at my house. And there on the planet Mars, which had almost the same atmosphere as the planet Saturn, my essence friend Gornahur Harhark very soon became acclimatized and began to exist almost freely. It was just during his stay on Mars that he devised that Tescahuano, or as your favorites call it, a telescope, thanks chiefly to which, as I've already told you, my observatory afterwards became particularly famous through the whole of the universe. The Tescahuano he constructed is indeed a marvel of being reason, as it increases the visibility of remote cosmic concentrations up to 7,285,000 times during certain processes in cosmic substances proceeding in the atmospheres surrounding almost all cosmic concentrations, as well as during certain processes in the cosmic etherochrylno of interspatial spheres. Thanks to this Tescahuano, I was sometimes fully able, while seated in my house on Mars, to observe almost everything that proceeded on those parts of the surface of other planets of this solar system, which, in the process of what is called the general system movement, were at the given time within the sphere of vision of my observatory. Well then, my dear boy, while Gornahor Harhark was then staying with me as my guest, and we were once together observing the existence of these favorites of yours, a certain fact, which we happened to notice, was the cause of a very serious exchange of opinions between us concerning the three-centered beings of that peculiar planet of yours. The result of this exchange of opinions of ours was that I undertook to descend onto the surface of that planet and to bring back to the planet Saturn a certain number of the beings called there apes, in order to carry out certain elucidating experiments with them concerning the fact we had noticed and which had then surprised us. At this point of Beelzebub's tales he was given a lithochambros, that is, a special metal plate on which is recorded the text of an etherogram, received from somewhere or other, the addressee having only to hold it to his perceptive hearing organ to hear everything communicated in it. When Beelzebub had in this way heard the contents of the lithochambros handed to him, he turned to his grandson and said, "You see, my boy, what coincidences occur in our great universe. The contents of this etherogram concern just your favorites in connection with these terrestrial beings I've just mentioned. That is, these apes. It has been sent to me from the planet Mars, and among other things, there is communicated in it that the three-centered beings of the planet Earth have again begun to revive what is called the ape question. I must tell you first of all that on account of a cause also ensuing from the abnormal being existence there was long ago crystallized, and there is periodically intensified in its functioning in the presences of those strange three-brained beings arising and existing on the planet Earth, a strange factor which from time to time produces in their presences a crescendo impulse, owing to which, during the periods of its action, they wish at all costs to find out whether they have descended from these apes or whether these apes have descended from them. Judging from the etherogram, this question is this time agitating chiefly those biped beings who breed there on the continent called America. Although this question always agitates them from time to time, yet every once in a while it becomes there for a long time, as they express it, the burning question of the day. I very well remember that this agitation of mind concerning the origin of these apes occurred there among them for the first time when, as they also like to express it, their center of culture was Tikliamish. The beginning of that agitation of mind there was the wise-acing of a certain learned being of new formation there named Menitkel. This Menitkel then became a learned being, firstly, because his childless aunt was an excellent what is called matchmaker, and mixed a great deal with power-possessing beings, and secondly, because when by age he was approaching the threshold of the being of a responsible being, he received on his birthday a gift of a book entitled Manual of Bon-Ton and Love-Letter Writing. Being materially secure and therefore quite free, thanks to an inheritance left him by his uncle, a former pawnshop proprietor, he, out of boredom, compiled a massive and erudite work in which he spun out, concerning the origin of these apes, an elaborate theory with every kind of logical proof, but of course with such logical proofs as could be perceived and crystallized only in the reasons of those freaks who have taken your fancy. This Menitkel then proved by his theory that these fellow apes of theirs had descended neither more nor less than from what are called people who became wild. And the other terrestrial beings of that period, as it had already become proper to them, implicitly believed this Auntie's darling without any essence criticism whatsoever. And from that time on, this question, which had then agitated the strange reason of your favorites, became a subject of discussion and fantasizing, and existed right up to what is called the seventh in turn great general planetary process of reciprocal destruction. Thanks to this maleficent idea, there was even fixed in the instincts of most of these unfortunates of that period still another abnormal, what is called dictatory factor, which began to engender in their common presences the false feeling that these ape beings were presumably sacred, and the abnormal factor engendering this sacrilegious impulse, also passing by inheritance from generation to generation, has reached the instincts of very many beings even at the present time. This false idea that arose, and was fixed there owing to the said pawn-shop progeny, existed during nearly 2 of their centuries, and became an inseparable part of the reason of the majority of them, and only various events proceeding from the mentioned general planetary process effaced it, until it ultimately completely disappeared from their common presences. But when what is called their cultured existence was concentrated on the continent named Europe, and when the time of the maximum intense manifestation of the peculiar illness there named to wiseacre had again come round, which illness, by the way, had already long before become subject to the fundamental cosmic law of heptaparaparshanok, according to which it had, in respect of intensity, also to function with a certain periodicity, then, to the grief of the 3-brained beings of the whole of the universe, that ape question, namely, the question who is descended from whom, again arose, and having become crystallized, again became a part of the presence of the abnormal reason of your favorites. The stimulus for the revival there of this ape question was this time also a learned being, and of course also great, but now a learned being of quite a new formation, namely Darwin. And this great learned being, basing his theory on that same logic of theirs, began to prove exactly the opposite of what Menitkel had said, namely that it was they themselves who were descended from these Mr. Apes. And as for the objective reality of the theories of both these great terrestrial learned beings, I am reminded of one of the wise sayings of our esteemed Mullah Nasruddin, namely, they were both very successful, though of course not without luck, in finding the authentic godmother of the incomparable Scheherazade on an old dunghill. In any case, you must know and bear in mind that for many centuries just this question among similar ephemeral questions has provided material for the kind of mentation which is considered among your favorites as the highest manifestation of reason. These favorites of yours would, in my opinion, get quite a correct answer to this question which always excites them. That is the question how the apes arose, if they were able, in the given case, to apply one of these sayings again of our dear Mullah Nasruddin, who on many occasions used to say, "The cause of every misunderstanding must be sought only in women." If they had attempted the solution of this enigmatic question with that wisdom of his, then perhaps they would have finally discovered whence and how these countrymen of theirs had originated. As this question of the genealogy of these apes there is indeed exceedingly abstruse and unusual, I shall inform your reason about this also as far as possible from every aspect. In fact, neither have they descended from apes, nor have apes descended from them, but the cause of the origin of these apes is in this case, just as in every other misunderstanding there, also their women. I must tell you first of all that the species of terrestrial ape beings now arising there under several different exterior forms never existed at all before the second Transapalnian perturbation. Only afterwards did the genealogy of their species begin. The causes of the arising of this misconceived being, as well as the cause of all the other events more or less serious in an objective sense, which occur on the surface of that ill-fated planet, ensue from two sources, totally independent of each other. The first of them, as always, was the same lack of foresight on the part of certain most high, most very saintly cosmic individuals. And the second was, in the given case, also the same abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence established by them themselves. The point is that when the second Transapalnian perturbation occurred to that ill-fated planet, then, besides its chief continent Atlantis, many other large and small terra firmas entered within the planet, and in their place new terra firmas appeared on the surface of the planet. These displacements of the parts of the common presence of that ill-fated planet then continued for several days, with repeated planetary tremors, and with such manifestations as could not fail to evoke terror in the consciousness and feelings of beings of every kind. During that same period, many of your three-brained favorites who chanced to survive together with various one-brained and two-brained beings of other forms unexpectedly struck upon other newly formed terra firmas in entirely new places unfamiliar to them. It was just at this period that many of these strange Kezchapmartnian three-brained beings of active and passive sex, or as they say, men and women, were compelled to exist for some years there apart, that is to say, without the opposite sex. Before relating how this then further occurred, I must explain to you a little more in detail concerning that sacred substance which is the final result of the evolving transformations of every kind of being food, formed in the presence of every being without distinction of brain system. This sacred substance, which arises in the presences of beings of every kind, is almost everywhere called Ixioihari, but your favorites on the planet Earth call it sperm. Thanks to the all-gracious foresight and command of our common Father and Creator, and according to the actualization of great nature, this sacred substance arises in the presences of all beings without distinction of brain system and exterior coating, chiefly in order that by its means they might consciously or automatically fulfill that part of their being duty which consists in the continuation of their species. But in the presences of three-brained beings, it arises also in order that it might be consciously transformed in their common presences, for coating their highest being bodies for their own being. Before the second Transapalnian perturbation there, which period of their planet the contemporary three-brained beings define by the words, before the loss of the continent Atlantis, when various consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer had already begun to be crystallized in their presences, a being impulse began to be formed in them which later became predominant. This impulse is now called pleasure, and in order to satisfy it, they had already begun to exist in a way unbecoming to three-centered beings, namely, most of them gradually began to remove this same sacred being substance from themselves, only for the satisfaction of the said impulse. Well then, my boy, owing to the fact that most of the three-brained beings of the planet Earth thereafter carried out the process of the removal from themselves of this sacred substance, which is constantly formed in them, not at certain periods normally established by great nature for beings in accordance with their organization, simply for the purpose of the continuation of their species, and also owing to the fact that most of them ceased to utilize this sacred substance consciously for coating their higher being bodies, the result was obtained that when they do not remove it from themselves by ways which had then already become mechanical, they naturally must experience a sensation called circliniamen, or as your favorites there would say, the state defined by the words out of sorts, which state is invariably accompanied by what is called mechanical suffering. Remind me at some opportune moment about the said periods fixed by nature for the normal process of the utilization of exioihari by beings of different brain systems, for the purpose of the continuation of their species, and I shall explain it to you in detail. Well then, in consequence of the aforesaid, and because, just like us, they are also only Kezchapmartnian beings, and the normal removal from their presences of this sacred substance, which constantly and inevitably arises in them, can proceed exclusively only with the opposite sex, when they utilize it for the continuation of the species by means of the sacred process El Muarno, and also because they were not in the habit of utilizing it for the purpose of coating their higher being bodies. These chance surviving three-brained beings there, namely those who had already been existing, as it is not becoming for three-brained beings to exist, that is to say, when during several of their years they had existed without beings of the opposite sex, began to turn to various anti-natural means for the removal from themselves of the sacred substance, exioihari, formed in them. The beings of the male sex then turned to the anti-natural means called mordorten and androparasti, or, as the contemporary beings would say, onanism and pederasty, and these anti-natural means fully satisfied them. But for the three-brained beings of the passive sex, or as they are called, women, the said anti-natural methods proved to be not sufficiently satisfying, and so the poor woman orphans of that time, being already then more cunning and inventive than the men there, began to seek out and accustom beings of other forms of the given place to be their partners. Well then, it was after these partnerships that those kinds of beings also began to appear in our great universe, who in themselves are, as our dear Mullah Nasruddin would say, neither one thing nor the other. Concerning the possibility of this abnormal blending of two different kinds of exioiharis, for the conception and arising of a new planetary body of a being, it is necessary to explain to you also the following. On the planet Earth, just as on other planets of our universe where Kezchapmartnian three-brained beings breed and exist, that is to say, those three-brained beings, the formation of whose exioihari for the purpose of creating a new being must obligatorily proceed in the presences of two distinct independent sexes, The fundamental difference between the sacred Exioiharis formed in the presences of the distinct and opposite sexes of Keschapmartnian beings, that is to say, in men and women, is that in the Exioihari formed in the presences of beings of the male sex, the localized sacred affirming or positive force of the sacred Triamazikamno participates, while for the complete formation of the Exioihari in the presences of beings of the female sex, there participates the localized sacred denying or negative force of the same sacred law. And owing to the same all-gracious foresight and command of our Father of everything existing in the great universe, and according to the actualizations of Great Mother Nature, then in certain surrounding conditions and with the participation of the third separately localized holy force of the sacred Triamazikamno, namely the holy force called reconciling, the blending of these two Exioiharis, arising in two distinct, independent, different beings, just gives, owing to the process called the process of the sacred El Muarno, which proceeds between those beings of opposite sex, the beginning for the arising of a new being. And the possibility in the given case of such an abnormal blending of two different kinds of Exioihari, then, occurred owing only to a certain cosmic law called the affinity of the number of the totality of vibrations, which proceeded owing to the second Transalpalnian perturbation to this ill-fated planet, and which then still continued to act for its own common presence. Concerning this cosmic law just mentioned, it is now absolutely necessary to tell you that it arose and began to exist in the universe after the fundamental sacred law of Triamazikamno was changed by our Creator for the purpose of rendering the Hieropass harmless, and after its previously totally independent holy parts had begun to be dependent upon forces coming from outside. You will understand this cosmic law also in all its aspects when, as I've already promised you, I shall explain to you in detail all the fundamental laws in general of world creation and world existence. Meanwhile, know, concerning this question, that in general, everywhere on normally existing planets of our great universe, the Exioihari, formed in the presence of a three-brained being who has perceptive and transformative organs for localizing the holy affirming part of the sacred Triamazikamno, that is to say, a Keschapmartnian being of the male sex, can, owing to the just mentioned cosmic law, never be blended with the Exioihari formed in the presence of a Keschapmartnian two-brained being of the opposite sex. At the same time, the Exioihari formed in the three-brained Keschapmartnian being of the female sex can, sometimes, in those cases when a special combination of the blending of cosmic forces is obtained, and the mentioned law comes into effect, be completely blended under certain surrounding conditions with the Exioihari formed in two-brain Keschapmartnian beings of the male sex, but only as the active factor is such an actualizing process of the fundamental sacred Triamazikamno. In short, during the said terrible years on this planet of yours, a result very rare in the universe was obtained. That is to say, there was obtained the blending of the Exioiharis of two Keschapmartnian beings of different brain systems of opposite sexes, and as a result, there arose the ancestors of these terrestrial misconceived beings, now called apes, who give your favorites no peace, and who from time to time agitate their strange reason. But when, after the mentioned terrible period there on your planet, when the relatively normal process of ordinary existence was re-established, and your favorites of different sexes again began to find each other and to exist together, then the continuation of the species of the ape beings was thereafter actualized also among beings similar to themselves. And this continuation of their species by these abnormally arisen ape beings there could be further continued among themselves, because the conception for the arising of the first of these abnormal beings had also proceeded, owing to those same mentioned external conditions, thanks to which the presences of future Keschap-Martnian beings of active or of passive sex are generally determined. The most interesting result of this already excessive abnormal manifestation of the three-brained beings of your planet is that there now exist a great many species of generations of ape beings differing in exterior form, and each of these varied species bears a very definite resemblance to some form of a two-brained quadruped being still existing there. This came about because the blending of the Exioehari of the Keschap-Martnian three-brained beings there of the female sex, which served as a beginning for the arising of the ancestors of these apes, then proceeded with the active Exioehari of those same varied quadruped beings existing there up to the present time. And indeed, my boy, when during the period of my last personal stay on the planet Earth, I chanced during my travels to meet with the said various independent species of apes, and when, by a habit which has become second nature, I also observed them, I constated very definitely that the whole of the inner functioning and what are called the automatic posture of each separate species of these contemporary apes there are exactly like those present in the whole of the presences of some normally arisen quadruped being there, and that even what are called their facial features very definitely resemble those of the said quadrupeds. But on the other hand, that what are called the psychic features of all the separate species of these apes there are absolutely identical, even down to the details, with those of the psyche of the three-brained beings there of the female sex. At this point of his tales, Beelzebub made a long pause, and looking at his favorite, Hussein, with a smile which very clearly expressed a double meaning, he, continuing to smile, said, "In the text of the etherogram which I have just received, it is further said that in order this time finally to settle who has descended from whom, whether they from apes or the apes from them, these freaks, your favorites, have decided to carry out scientific experiments, and furthermore that several of them have already left for the continent of Africa, where many of these apes breed, with the object of bringing back from there the number required for these scientific investigations of theirs. To judge by this etherogram, the beings of the planet Earth who have taken your fancy are again, in their turn, up to their extraordinary tricks. From all I have learned about them during my observations, I foresee that this scientific experiment will of course very greatly interest other of your favorites also, and will serve for a time as material to their strange reason for endless discussion and talks. And all this will be quite in the order of things there. Concerning the scientific experiment itself, which they propose to carry out with the apes taken back from Africa, I can with certainty say beforehand that at any rate the first part of it will, without any doubt, succeed wonderfully well. And it will succeed wonderfully well because the apes themselves, as beings of what is called a Terebelnian result, are already, owing to their nature, extremely fond of occupying themselves with titillation, and before the day is out will no doubt participate in and greatly assist your favorites in this scientific experiment of theirs. As for those beings there who are going to carry out this scientific experiment, and as for any benefit from it, for the other three-brained beings there, it can all be pictured to oneself, if one remembers the profoundly wise saying of our same Honorable Mullah Nasr ad-Din, in which he says, "Happy is that father whose son is even busy with murder and robbery, for he himself will then have no time to get accustomed to occupy himself with titillation." Yes, my boy, it seems that I have not yet told you why and by whom, since I left the solar system Ors, I am kept informed by etherograms of the most important events which proceed on various planets of that system, and of course also about events proceeding on your planet Earth. You remember, I told you, that my first descent in person upon the surface of that planet of yours took place on account of one of the young beings of our tribe, who then had no desire to stay there any longer, but returned with us to the planet Mars, where he later became a very good chief over all the beings of our tribe existing on that planet, and who is now already the chief over all the beings in general of our tribe who for various reasons still exist on certain planets of that system Ors. Well then, my boy, when I left that system, I presented my famous observatory to him, with everything in it, and in gratitude for this he promised to report every month, according to the time calculation of the planet Mars, all the more important events occurring on the planets of that system. And now, this chief keeps me very accurately informed of the most important events proceeding on all the planets on which there is a being existence. And knowing my great interest in the three-brained beings breeding on the planet Earth, he does his best, as I now see, to elucidate and send me information concerning all those manifestations of theirs which can give me now also the possibility of being constantly informed of the whole process of the ordinary existence of these three-brained beings, even though I find myself already inaccessibly remote even for their featherweight thoughts. That chief of our beings who remains there collects the various kinds of information he communicates concerning the three-brained beings of the planet Earth, either by means of his own observations of them through the great Tescawano which I left him, or from reports which in their turn are communicated to him by those three beings of our own tribe who chose to exist forever on the planet Earth, and all three of whom have at the present time on the continent of Europe different substantial independent undertakings indispensable for everyone existing there under the prevailing conditions. One of them has in one of the large cities an undertaker's business. The second, in another large city, has a bureau for what are called matchmaking and divorce. And the third is the proprietor of many offices founded by himself in various cities for what is called money exchange. However, my boy, owing to this etherogram, I have wandered a long way from my original tale. Let us go back to our former theme. Well then, upon this fourth flight of mine to the planet Earth, our ship Occasion descended onto the sea called the Red Sea. And we descended upon this sea because it washed the eastern shores of that continent where I wished to go, namely to that continent then called Grabontsi, and now called Africa, on which those ape beings I needed then bred more than on any other of the terra firma parts of the surface of that planet of yours, and also because this sea was at that period particularly convenient for the mooring of our ship occasion. But what was still more important was that on one of its sides that country was situated, which was then called Nilia, and is now called Egypt, where those beings of our tribe then existed who wished to remain on that planet, and with whose help I intended to collect the apes. Well then, having descended upon the Red Sea, we sailed from the ship Occasion on Epodrenech to the shore, and afterwards on camels we came to that town where our beings existed, and which was then the capital of the future Egypt. This capital city was then called Thebes. On the very first day of my arrival in the city of Thebes, one of the beings of our tribe existing there told me, among other things, in the course of our conversation, that the beings of the earth of that locality had devised a new system for observing other cosmic concentrations from their planet, and that they were then constructing what was required in order to carry it into effect, and also, as everybody there said, that the convenience and possibilities of this new system were excellent, and until then unparalleled on the earth. And when he had related all he had himself seen with his own eyes, I immediately became greatly interested, because from his description of certain details of this new construction there, it seemed to me that these terrestrial beings had perhaps found a means of overcoming that inconvenience about which I myself had just previously been thinking a great deal, while I was completing the construction of my observatory on the planet Mars. And so I decided to postpone for a while my first intention of immediately going further south on that continent to collect the apes I needed, and instead to go first where the said construction was being made, in order on the spot to become personally acquainted with it from every aspect, and to find out all about it. Well then, the day following our arrival in the city Thebes, accompanied by one of the beings of our tribe who already had many friends there, and also by the chief constructor of the said construction, and of course by our Ahun also, I went this time on what is called a chor-tetev, down the tributary of that great river now called the Nile. Near where this river flowed into a large Salia-Kuryapnian area, those constructions were just being completed, one part of which then interested me. The district itself where the work was being carried on, both for this new what they called observatory, and for several other constructions for the welfare of their being existence, was then called Avazlin. A few years later it came to be called there Kaironana, and at the present time it's simply called the outskirts of Cairo. The mentioned constructions had been begun long before by one of what are called their pharaohs, the name by which the beings of that region called their kings. And at the time of my fourth flight to the earth, and my first visit to this place, the special constructions he had begun were already being completed by his grandson, also a pharaoh. Although the observatory which interested me was not yet quite finished, nevertheless observations of the exterior visibility of cosmic concentrations could be made from it, and the results issuing from them and the reciprocal action of these results could be studied. Those beings who were occupied with such observations and studies were called, at that period on the earth, astrologers. But when afterwards that psychic disease of theirs called wise-acing became finally fixed there, owing to which these specialists of theirs also shriveled and shrank, and became specialists only in giving names to remote cosmic concentrations, they came to be called astronomers. Inasmuch as the difference in significance and sense in relation to surrounding beings between those from among the three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, who at that time were such professionals, and those who have now, as it were, the same occupation, might show you, so to say, the obviousness of the steady deterioration of the degree of crystallization of data engendering the sane logical mentation which ought to be present in the common presences of your favorites as three-brained beings, I therefore find it necessary to explain to you and to help you to have an approximate understanding of this difference, which is also changing for the worse. At that period, these terrestrial three-brained beings already of responsible age, whom the others named astrologers, besides making the said observations and investigations of various other cosmic concentrations for the purpose of a greater, as it is said, detailizing of that branch of general learning of which they were representatives, fulfilled several further definite essence obligations taken upon themselves towards surrounding beings similar to themselves. Among their fundamental definite obligations was that they also, like our Zerlichners, had to advise all the conjugal pairs in their what was then called flock, according to the types of those pairs, about the time and form of the process of the sacred El Muarno, for the purpose of a desirable and corresponding conception of their results. And when such results were actualized, or as they themselves say, newly born, they had to draw up their oblequiunarish, which is the same as what your favorites call horoscope. And later, either they themselves or their substitutes had, during the whole period of the formation of the newly born for responsible existence, and of their subsequent responsible existence, to guide them and give corresponding indications on the basis of the said oblequiunarish, and also on the basis of the cosmic laws constantly explained by them flowing from the actions of the results of other large cosmic concentrations in general on the process of being existence of beings on all planets. These indications of theirs, and also their, so to say, warning counsels, consisted in the following. When a function became disharmonized, or only began to be disharmonized in the presence of any being of their flock, then this being applied to the astrologer of his district, who, on the basis of the said oblequiunarish, made by him, and on the basis of the changes expected, according to his calculations in the processes proceeding in the atmosphere, flowing in their turn from the action of the other planets of their solar system, indicated just what he had to do to his planetary body, at which definite periods of the Crentonalnian movements of their planet, as for instance in which direction to lie, how to breathe, what movements preferably to make, with which types to avoid relations, and many things of the same kind. In addition to all this, they assigned to the beings at the 7th year of their existence, likewise on the basis of these oblequiunarishes, corresponding mates of the opposite sex for the purpose of fulfilling one of the chief being duties, that is, continuation of the race. Or, as your favorites would say, they assigned them husbands and wives. Justice must be done to your favorites of the period when these astrologers existed among them, They then indeed very strictly carried out the indications of these astrologers, and made their conjugal unions exclusively only according to their indications. Therefore, at that period, in regard to their conjugal unions, they always corresponded according to the type, just as such pairs correspond everywhere on planets on which Keschamartnian beings also breed. These ancient terrestrial astrologers made these matches successfully, because even if they were very far from the knowledge of many cosmic trogoauto-egocratic truths, yet they at least already very well knew the laws of the influence of different planets of their solar system on the beings breeding on their own planet, namely, the influence of these planets on a being at the moment of his conception, for further formation as well as for his complete acquisition of the being of a responsible being. Having, thanks to the information transmitted to them from generation to generation, a many-centuried practical knowledge, they already knew which types of the passive sex can correspond to which of the active sex. And owing to all this, the pairs matched according to their indications almost turned out to be corresponding, and not as it proceeds there at the present time. And that is to say, they are now united in conjugal pairs who nearly always do not correspond in type, in consequence of which, during the continuation of the entire existence of these couples there, about half of their, as they say, inner life is spent only on what our esteemed Mullah Nasr ad-Din expresses in one of his sayings by the following words: "What a good husband he is, or what a good wife she is, whose whole inner world is not busy with the constant nagging of the other half." In any case, my boy, if these astrologers had continued to exist there, then surely, thanks to their further practicing, the existence of the beings of this unfortunate planet would by now have gradually become such that their family relations would at least have been a little like the existence of similar beings on other planets of our great universe. But all this, which was beneficently established in the process of their existence, they have also sent, like all their other good attainments, without even having had time to make use of it, to the gluttonous swine of our respected Mullah Nasr ad-Din. And these astrologers of theirs, as usually happens there, also at first began gradually to shrink, and then entirely, as is said, vanished. After the total abolition among them of the duties of these astrologers, other professionals in the same sphere appeared in their place, but this time from among the learned beings of new formation, who also began to observe and study, as it were, the results issuing from various large cosmic concentrations, and their influence on the existence of the beings of their planet. But as the ordinary beings around these professionals soon noticed that their observations and studies consisted merely in inventing names for various remote suns and planets meaning nothing to them, existing in milliards in the universe, and in measuring, as it were, by a method known to them alone, and which constituted their professional secret, the distance between the cosmic points seen from their planets through their child's toys called by them telescopes, they began to call them, as I've already told you, astronomers. Now, my boy, that we have spoken also about these contemporary ultra-fantasists from among your favorites, we might as well, again imitating the form of mentation and the verbal expression of our dear teacher Mullah Nasr ad-Din, also illuminatingly enlighten you about their significance so esteemed by your favorites. First of all, you should know about that ordinary cosmic something actualized by these same terrestrial types, which is in general always actualized of itself for every cosmic unit, and which serves for beings with objective reason as what is called an issuing source for pondering about the explanation of the sense and meaning of any given cosmic result. This same something, which serves as an issuing source for discovering the significance of these terrestrial contemporary types, is a wise-acing map named by them themselves, of course unconsciously, the Map Inventory of the Heavenly Spaces. There is no need for us to draw any other logical conclusion from this issuing source specially actualized for them. It will be sufficient merely to say that the name itself of this map of theirs shows that the designations made on it cannot in any way be other than entirely relative, because with the possibilities at their disposal, though they break their esteemed heads over devising names and calculating various kinds of measurements, they can see from the surface of their planet only those suns and planets which to their good fortune do not very quickly change the course of their falling in relation to their own planet, and thus give them the possibility during a long period of time, of course long as compared with the brevity of their own existence, to observe them, and as they bombastically express themselves, mark down their positions. In any case, my boy, however worthless the results of the activities of these contemporary representatives of learning among your favorites, please don't be angry with them. If they do not bring any benefit at all to your favorites, they at least do not do them any great harm. After all, they must be occupied with something. It is not for nothing that they wear spectacles of German origin and special smocks sewed in England. Let them be occupied with this. God bless them. Otherwise, like most of the other freaks there who are occupied with, as they say, their higher matters, they will busy themselves out of boredom, leading the struggle of 5 against 1. And it is known to all that the beings who are occupied with these matters always radiate from themselves vibrations very harmful for beings around them similar to themselves. Well, enough. Leave these contemporary titillators in peace, and let us continue our interrupted, definite theme. In view of the fact, my boy, that this conscious ability expressed in the creation of such a construction unparalleled both before and after this period, of which I was then an eyewitness, was also the result of the attainments of the beings, members of the learned society Akalan, which was formed on the continent of Atlantis before the second great terrestrial catastrophe. I think it will be best if, before continuing to explain to you further about the mentioned observatory and other constructions erected there for the welfare of being existence, I should tell you, even though briefly, about the history of the arising there of such an indeed great learned society consisting of ordinary 3-brained beings, as this learned society Akalan then was on the continent of Atlantis. It is imperatively necessary to inform you of this because, in the course of my further explanations concerning these 3-brained beings of the planet Earth who have taken your fancy, I shall in all probability have to refer more than once to that society of learned beings there. I must also tell you about the history of the arising and existence of that society there on the continent Atlantis, so that you may also know that if the 3-brained beings there on your planet, thanks to their being particular duty, that is to say, thanks to their conscious labors and intentional sufferings, ever attain anything, then not only do they utilize these for the good of their own being, but also a certain part of these attainments is transmitted, as with us, by inheritance, and becomes the property of their direct descendants. You can perceive such a law-conformable result there from the fact that although towards the end of the existence of the continent Atlantis, abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence had already begun to be established, and that after the second great catastrophe they deteriorated at such a rate that they soon finally crushed all their ableness to manifest the possibilities proper to the presences of the three-brained beings. Nevertheless, their attainments of learning passed by inheritance, at least partly, even though mechanically, to their remote direct descendants. I must first tell you that I learned about this history thanks to what are called Teleogi Nuras, which are at the present time in the atmosphere also of that planet Earth of yours. As you probably do not yet know exactly what a Teleogi Nura is, try to transubstantiate in the corresponding parts of your common presence the information concerning this cosmic actualization. A Teleogi Nura is a materialized idea or thought which, after its arising, exists almost eternally in the atmosphere of that planet on which it arises. Teleogi Nuras can be formed from such a quality of being contemplation as only those three-brained beings have and can actualize, who have coated their higher being bodies in their presences, and who have brought the perfecting of the reason of their higher being part up to the degree of the sacred Martphotai. And the sequential series of being ideas materialized in this way concerning any given event are called Korkaptilnian thought tapes. It seems that the said Korkaptilnian thought tapes concerning the history of the arising of the learned society Akalan were, as I found out much later, deliberately fixed by a certain eternal individual, Asuchilan, now a saint, who became coated in the common presence of a three-brained being named Tetatos, who arose on your planet on the continent of Atlantis, and who had existed there 4 centuries before the second great Transapalnian perturbation. These Korkaptilnian thought tapes are never destroyed as long as the given planet exists, which is in what is called the tempo of movement of the prime arising. And they are subject to none of those transformations from any cosmic causes whatsoever, to which all other cosmic substances and cosmic crystallizations are periodically subject. And however long a time may have already passed, every three-brained being in whose presence there has been acquired the ability to enter into the being state called Suiptakalknian contemplation can perceive and cognize the texts of these Korkaptilnian thought tapes. And so, my boy, I myself learned about the details of the arising there of the society Akaldan, partly from the text of the just mentioned Teleogi Nura, and partly from many data which I learned much later, namely, when having become interested also in this highly important factor there, I made my usual detailed investigations. According to the text of the mentioned Teleogi Nura, and to data which I subsequently learned, it became clear and definitely known to me that this learned society, Akaldan, which arose then on the continent Atlantis, and which was composed of three-brained beings of the earth, was formed 735 years before the second Transapalnian perturbation there. It was founded on the initiative of a being there named Belkutasi, who was then able to bring the perfecting of his higher being part to the being of a saint eternal individual. And this higher part of his now already dwells on the holy planet Purgatory. My elucidation of all those inner and outer being impulses and manifestations which caused this Belkutasi then to found that truly great society of ordinary three-brained beings, a society which in its time was throughout the whole universe called envied for imitation, showed that when this same later saint individual Belkutasi was once contemplating, according to the practice of every normal being, and his thoughts were, by association, concentrated on himself, that is to say, on the sense and aim of his existence, he suddenly sensed and cognized that the process of the functioning of the whole of him had until then proceeded not as it should have proceeded according to sane logic. This unexpected constatation shocked him so profoundly that thereafter he devoted the whole of himself exclusively to be able at any cost to unravel this and understand. First of all, he decided to attain without delay such a potency as would give him the strength and possibility to be quite sincere with himself, that is to say, to be able to conquer those impulses which had become habitual in the functioning of his common presence, from the many heterogeneous associations arising and proceeding in him, and which were started in him by all sorts of accidental shocks coming from outside, and also engendered within him, namely the impulses called self-love, pride, vanity, and so on. And when, after incredible what are called organic and psychic efforts, he attained to this, he then, without any mercy for these being impulses which had become inherent in his presence, began to think and recall just when and what various being impulses had arisen in his presence during the period preceding all this, and how he had consciously or unconsciously reacted to them. Analyzing himself in this manner, he began to recall just which impulses evoked which reactions in him, and his independently spiritualized parts, that is to say, in his body, in his feelings, and in his thoughts, and the state of his essence when he reacted to anything more or less attentively, and how and when, in consequence of such reactions of his, he had manifested consciously with his eye, or had acted automatically under the direction of his instinct alone. And it was just then that this bearer of the later saint individual Belkutasi, recalling in this way all his former perceptions, experiencings, and manifestations, clearly constated in consequence that his exterior manifestations did not at all correspond either to the perceptions or to the impulses definitely formed in him. Further, he then began to make similar sincere observations of the impressions coming from outside, as well as those formed within himself, which were perceived by his common presence, and he made them all with the same exhaustive, conscious verifications of how these impressions were perceived by his separate spiritualized parts, how and on what occasions they were experienced by the whole of his presence, and for what manifestations they became impulses. These exhaustive conscious observations and impartial constatations finally convinced Belkutasi that something proceeded in his own common presence not as it should have proceeded according to sane being logic. As it became clear to me during my subsequent detailed investigations, although Belkutasi had become indubitably convinced of the accuracy of his observations on himself, yet he doubted the correctness of his own sensations and understandings, and also the normalness of his own psychic organization. And he therefore set himself the task of elucidating, first of all, whether he was in general normal in sensing and understanding all this just in this way and not otherwise. To carry out this task of his, he decided to find out how the same would be sensed and cognized by others. With that aim, he began inquiring among his friends and acquaintances to try to find out from them how they sensed it all, and how they cognized their past and present perceptions and manifestations. Doing this, of course, very discreetly, so as not to touch the aforementioned impulses inherent in them, namely self-love, pride, and so on, which are unbecoming to three-brained beings. Thanks to these inquiries, Belkutasi gradually succeeded in evoking sincerity in his friends and acquaintances, and as a result, it turned out that all of them sensed and saw in themselves everything just the same as he did. Now, among these friends and acquaintances of Belkutasi, there were several earnest beings who were not yet entirely slaves to the action of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, and who, having penetrated to the gist of the matter, also became very seriously interested in it, and began to verify that which proceeded in themselves, and independently to observe those around them. Soon after, on the initiative of the same Belkutasi, they began to meet together from time to time and to share their observations and new constatations. After prolonged verifications, observations, and impartial constatations, this entire group of terrestrial beings also became categorically convinced, just like Belkutasi himself, that they were not as they ought to be. Not long after, many others also having such presences joined that group of terrestrial beings. And later, they founded that society which they named the Society of Akaldans. By the word Akaldan, the following conception was then expressed: the striving to become aware of the sense and aim of the being of beings. From the very beginning of the foundation of this society, Belkutasi himself stood at its head, and the subsequent actions of the beings of this society proceeded under his general guidance. For many terrestrial years, this society existed under the said name, and its member beings were then called Akaldan Sojourn. But later, when the members of this society, for purposes of a general character, were divided into a number of independent groups, the members belonging to different groups came to be called by different names. And this division of theirs into groups occurred for the following reason. When they had finally become convinced that there was something very undesirable in their presences, and they had begun to seek means and possibilities of achieving its removal in order to become such as, according to sane logic, they ought to have been, corresponding to the sense and aim of their existence, the elucidation of which, whatever it might have cost them, they made the basis of their task. And when they proceeded to actualize in practice this task previously decided upon by their reason, it very soon became clear that it was imperatively necessary for its fulfillment to have in their reason more detailed information of various special branches of knowledge. But as it proved impossible for each and every one of them to acquire the necessary special knowledge, they divided themselves for convenience into a number of groups so that each group might separately study one of these special branches of knowledge required for their common aim. Here, my boy, you should notice that genuine objective science just then arose and began to exist there for the first time, and developed normally up to the time of the second great catastrophe to their planet. Also, that the rate of the development of some of its separate branches then progressed at an indeed unprecedented tempo, and in consequence, many great and small cosmic what are called objective truths gradually began at that period to become evident also to those three-brained beings who have taken your fancy. The learned members of this first and perhaps last great terrestrial learned society were then divided into 7 independent groups, or as it is otherwise said, sections. And each of these groups or sections received its definite designation. The members of the first group of the society, Akalan, were called Akalan Folksovors, which meant that the beings belonging to that section studied the presence of their own planet, as well as the reciprocal action of its separate parts. The members of the second section were called Akalan Strassovors, and this meant that the beings belonging to that section studied what are called the radiations of all the other planets of their solar system, and the reciprocal action of these radiations. The members of the third section were called Akalan Metrosovors, which meant beings occupied with the study of that branch of knowledge similar to that branch of our general knowledge we call Silkornano, and which partly corresponded to what your contemporary favorites called mathematics. The members of the fourth group were called Akalan Psychosovors, and by this name they then defined those members of the society Akalan who made their observations of the perceptions, experiencings, and manifestations of beings like themselves, and verified their observations by statistics. The members of the fifth group were called Akalan Harnosovors, which meant that they were occupied with the study of that branch of knowledge which combined those 2 branches of contemporary science there, which your favorites call chemistry and physics. The members belonging to the sixth section were called Akalan Mistesovors, that is to say, beings who studied every kind of fact arising outside of themselves, those actualized consciously from without, and also those arising spontaneously, and which of them and in what cases are erroneously perceived by beings. And as regards the members of the seventh and last group, they were called Akalan Gespojnisovors. These members of the society Akalan devoted themselves to the study of those manifestations in the presences of the three-brained beings of their planet, which proceeded in them not in consequence of various functionings issuing from different kinds of qualities of impulses engendered owing to data already present in them, but from cosmic actions coming from outside and not depending on them themselves. The three-brained beings of your planet who became members of this society actually did a great deal in respect of approaching objective knowledge, which had never been done there before, and which perhaps will never be repeated. And here it is impossible not to express regret, and to repeat that to the most great misfortune of all terrestrial three-brained beings of all later epochs, it was just then, when after incredible being labors by members of that great society, the required tempo of work had already been established with regard to discernment, conscious on their part, and also with regard to their unconscious preparation for the welfare of their descendants, that in the heat of it all, certain of them constated, as I've already told you, that something serious was to occur to their planet in the near future. For the purpose of discerning the character of the anticipated serious event, they dispersed over the whole planet, and shortly afterwards, as I've already told you, the aforesaid second Transapalnian perturbation occurred to that ill-fated planet of yours. Well then, my boy, when after this catastrophe a number of the surviving beings, members of that great learned society, gradually came together again, they no longer having their native country, first settled together with most of the other surviving beings in the center of the continent Grabonsi. But later, when they had on the continent Grabonsi come to themselves, a little after the cataclysm not according to law, which had occurred, they decided jointly to try to re-establish and perhaps to continue to actualize in practice all those tasks which had formed the basis of their last society. As the manifestations of those abnormal conditions of being existence of most of the three-brained beings there which had already been established before the catastrophe had by this time already begun to boil furiously on the said part of the surface of the continent Grabonsi, these surviving members of the society Akalan looked for another place on the same continent for their permanent existence, more suitable for this work of theirs which demanded complete separateness. Such a suitable place they found in the valley of the large river flowing on the north of the said continent, and there indeed they all migrated together with their families, to continue in isolation the attainment of the tasks set by their society. This entire region, through which the said large river flowed, they first named Sakronakari. But this name was afterwards several times changed, and at the present time this region is called Egypt, while the said large river, then called Nipilhuachi, is now, as I've already said, called the Nile. Soon after certain former members of the learned society Akalan had settled on this part of the surface of the planet Earth, all the beings of our tribe, who then existed on the surface of that planet which has taken your fancy, migrated to the same place. And the relations of our tribe with that part of your planet, and also with the first migration there of the chance surviving former members of the society Akalan, were as follows. I told you once that just before the second Transapalnian perturbation, our party Pythoness, while prophesying, insisted that all the beings of our tribe should without delay migrate for the continuation of their existence on that planet to a definite part of the surface of that same continent now called Africa. This definite part of the surface of the continent which the Pythoness indicated lay just at the source of the said large river Nipilhuachi, where the beings of our tribe existed all the time the said second Transapalnian perturbation lasted, as well as later when everything had gradually resumed its relatively normal state, and when most of the surviving beings had then almost forgotten what had happened, and had again formed, just as if nothing had occurred to them, one of their famous centers of culture, in the very center of that future Africa. And it was just then when the former members of the society Akalan were searching for a suitable place for their permanent existence, that they chanced to meet a number of the beings of our tribe who advised them to migrate to the country further down the said river. Our acquaintanceship and our friendly relations with many of the former members of the society Akalan had already begun on the continent Atlantis, almost from the founding of that society. Do you remember I told you that when I descended to that planet for the first time, and the beings of our tribe assembled in the city of Samlios, with my participation in order together to find a way out of the difficult situation that had been created? Those general meetings of ours were held in one of the sections of the principal cathedral of the society Akalan, and from that time on good relations were established between many beings of our tribe and certain members of this society. And there in that future Egypt, whither both had migrated in the said way, the relations of the beings of our tribe with the authentic former members themselves who chanced to be saved, and also with the descendants of other authentic members, remained uninterrupted and continued almost until the departure of our tribe from your planet. Although the hope of the few chance surviving members of the society Akalan that they would be able to resume the actualizing of the task of their society was not fulfilled, nevertheless, thanks to them alone, there still continued to be present in the presences of beings of several subsequent generations after the loss of Atlantis, the instinctive conviction concerning the sense of what is called their completed personal being. In addition, thanks to them, something of what had been attained by the reason of the three-brained beings there also nevertheless survived, when that reason was still normal in them. And after a while, this something began mechanically to be transmitted by inheritance from generation to generation, and reached the beings of quite recent periods, even to several beings of contemporary times. Among those results of the learned attainments of the members of the society Akalan, which were transmitted by inheritance, were also, without question, those ingenious and solid constructions which I saw being erected during this fourth descent of mine to your planet, by the beings of whom I am just going to inform you, who were breeding on that part of the surface of the continent of the present Africa. Although the expectations that I had formed from all that our countrymen had told me concerning the mentioned new observatory there, before I had seen it with my own eyes, were not justified, nevertheless, the observatory itself and also the other construction of the beings then of that region proved to be exceedingly ingenious, and provided data for the enrichment of my common presence, by a great deal of productive information for my consciousness. And in order that you may clearly represent to yourself and understand how these various constructions were then erected by the three-brained beings of this region for the welfare of their being existence, I think it will be enough if I explain to you in as great detail as possible how the particularity of their ingenious practical invention was manifested in respect of their new observatory, on account of which I decided to visit that region. For this purpose, I must first of all inform you of two facts connected with the change in the common presences of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy. The first fact is that at the outset, while they were still existing normally, that is, as it is in general becoming to all three-brained beings to exist, and while they had what is called Olues Tesnochnian sight, they could also perceive at a distance proper to be perceived by ordinary three-brained beings, the visibility of all great as well as small cosmic concentrations existing beyond them during every process of the omnipresent Okidanoch, which proceeded in their atmosphere. In addition, those of them who were consciously perfected, and had thereby brought the sensibility of the perception of their organ of sight, like three-brained beings everywhere else, up to what is called the always ultra tesnochnian state, acquired the possibility of perceiving also the visibility of all these cosmic units situated at the same distance, which arise and have their further existence dependent upon the crystallizations localized directly from the sacred Theomertmalogos, that is to say, from the emanations of our most holy Son Absolute. And later, when the same constant abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence were finally established, as a consequence of great nature was compelled, for reasons of which I've already once told you, among other limitations, also to degenerate the functioning of their organ of sight into what is called koretosnochnian, that is to say, into the state proper to the presences of one-brained and two-brained beings. Then, thereafter, they were able to perceive the visibility of their great as well as their small concentrations, situated beyond them only when the sacred process Aieoioa proceeded in the omnipresent active element Okidanok, in the atmosphere of their planet, or as they themselves say, according to their understanding and their own perceptions, on dark nights. And the second fact, by virtue of the same degeneration of their sight into koretesnochnian, is based on that law common to all beings, namely, that the results obtained from every manifestation of the omnipresent Okidanok are perceived by the organs of sight only when in immediate contact with those vibrations which are formed in beings, and which actualize the functioning of the being organ for perceiving, at the given moment, the visibility of cosmic concentrations situated beyond them. That is to say, only when the said results of the manifestation of the omnipresent Okidanok proceed up to the limit beyond which, according to the quality of the given organ for perceiving visibility, what is called the momentum of the impulse dies down, or, to put it otherwise, they perceive the visibility of objects only when almost next to them. But if these results take place beyond the mentioned limit, then this manifestation does not at all extend to those beings in whose presences there are organs for the perception of visibility, formed only by the results of the totality of itoklanos. Here it is very opportune to repeat one of the profound sayings seldom used there of our Mullah Nasruddin, which very neatly defines the given case, that is, to this degree of the limitation of the perception of visibility of your contemporary favorites. This wise saying of his, seldom used there, consists of the following words: "Show me the elephant the blind man has seen, and only then will I believe that you have really seen a fly." Well then, my boy, thanks to that artificial adaptation which I had there seen for the observation of other cosmic concentrations, and which was being constructed in that future Egypt on the initiative issuing from the reasons of the remote descendants of the member beings of that learned society Akalan, any one of these unfortunate favorites of yours, in spite of the koretesnochnian sight, which had long before become inherent to them, could nevertheless acquire the ability to perceive freely, at any time, as they say, of the day and night, the visibility of all those remote cosmic concentrations which in the process of the general cosmic harmonious movement come within the sphere of the horizon of their observation. In order to overcome this limitation of their organ of the perception of visibility, they then invented the following, Their Tescawano, or telescope, the construction of which, it must here be said, passed to them also from their remote ancestors, they did not fix on the surface of their planet, as was usually done there and is still done now, but they placed this Tescawano very deep within the planet, and they carried out their observations of the cosmic concentrations found beyond the atmosphere of their planet through specially bored pike-like hollows. The observatory I then saw had 5 of these hollows. They began in relation to the horizon from different places of the surface of the planet occupied by the observatory, but they all met at a small underground common hollow, which was something like a cave. From there, the specialists, then called astrologers, made their observations for the purpose of studying, as I've already told you, the visible presences and results of the reciprocal action of other cosmic concentrations belonging to their own solar system, as well as to other systems of the great universe. They made these observations of theirs through any one of the mentioned hollows, which looked out in different directions onto their horizon, according to the given position of their planet, relative to the cosmic concentration observed in the process of the common cosmic harmonious movement. I repeat, my boy, that although the chief peculiarity of the observatory constructed there by the 3-brained beings of the future Egypt proved not to be new to me, since this principle had also been utilized in my observatory on Mars, with only this difference, that my 7 long pipes were fixed not within the planet but on it. Nevertheless, all their innovations were so interesting in detail that, for any case that might arise, I even made during my stay there a detailed sketch of everything I saw, and later even used something of it for my own observatory. And as regards the other constructions there, I shall perhaps tell you about them in detail sometime later. But, meanwhile, I will only say that all these independent constructions, which were then not quite finished, were situated not far from the observatory itself, and were intended, as I elucidated during my inspection under the guidance of the constructor who accompanied us, and who was a friend of one of our tribe, partly for the purpose of observing other suns and planets of our great universe, and partly for determining and intentionally directing the course of the surrounding atmosphere in order to obtain the climate desired. All these constructions of theirs occupied a fairly large open space of that part of the said region, and were enclosed by a special lattice work made of the plant then called their Zalnakatar. It is extremely interesting to notice here that they erected at the chief center of that huge enclosure a rather large of course in comparison with the size of their presences, stone statue called Sphinx, which strongly reminded me of the statue I saw on my first descent in person to your planet in the city of Samlios, just opposite the enormous building belonging to the learned society Akalan, and which was then called the chief cathedral of the society Akalan. The statue I saw in the city of Samlios, and which greatly interested me, was the emblem of this society, and was called Conscience. It represented an allegorical being, each part of whose planetary body was composed of a part of the planetary body of some definite form of being existing there, but of the parts of those beings of other forms, who, according to the crystallized notion of the 3-brained beings there, had to perfection one or another being function. The main mass of the planetary body of the said allegorical being was represented by the trunk of a being there of a definite form called bull. This bull trunk rested on the four legs of another being existing there, also of a definite form, called lion. And to that part of the bull trunk, called its back, two large wings were attached, similar in appearance to those of a strong bird being breeding there, called eagle. And on the place where the head should be, there was fixed to the bull's trunk, by means of a piece of amber, two breasts, representing in themselves what are called breasts of a virgin. When I became interested on the continent Atlantis in this strange allegorical image, and then inquired about its meaning, one of the learned members of the Great Society of Men Beings explained it to me as follows. This allegorical figure is the emblem of the society Akalan, and serves for all its members as a stimulus, constantly to recall and awaken in them the corresponding impulses attributed to this allegorical figure. Further, he explained, each part of this allegorical figure gives to every member of our society in all the three independently associating parts of his common presence, namely in the body, in the thoughts, and in the feelings, a shock for corresponding associations for those separate cognizances which in their totality can alone give us the possibility of gradually getting rid of those undesirable factors present in every one of us, both those transmitted to us by heredity as well as those acquired by ourselves personally, which gradually engender within us impulses undesirable for us, and as a consequence of which we are not as we might be. This emblem of ours constantly reminds and indicates to us that it is possible to attain freedom from what I have mentioned only if we compel our common presences always to think, feel, and act in corresponding circumstances according to that which is expressed in this emblem of ours. And this emblem of ours is understood by all of us, members of the Society Akalan, in the following way. The trunk of this allegorical being, represented by the trunk of a bull, means that the factor crystallized in us and which engender in our presences the impulses maleficent for us, those we have inherited as well as those we have personally acquired, can be regenerated only by indefatigable labors, namely, by those labors for which, among the beings of our planet, the bull is particularly fitted. That this trunk rests on the legs of a lion means that the said labors should be performed with that cognizance and feeling of courage and faith in one's might, the property of which might is possessed among all the beings of the earth in the highest degree by the possessor of these legs, the mighty lion. The wings of the strongest and the highest soaring of all birds, the eagle, attached to the bull trunk, constantly remind the members of our society that during the said labors and with the mentioned inner psychic properties of self-respect, it is necessary to meditate continually on questions not related to the direct manifestations required for ordinary being existence. And as regards the strange image of the head of our allegorical being in the form of the breasts of a virgin, this expresses that love should predominate always and in everything during the inner and outer functionings evoked by one's consciousness. such a love as can arise and be present only in the presences of concentrations formed in the lawful parts of every whole responsible being in whom the hopes of our common Father are placed, and that the head is fixed to the trunk of the bull with amber, signifies that this love should be strictly impartial, that is to say, completely separated from all the other functions proceeding in every whole responsible being. In order, my boy, that the sense of this latter emblem put into the material called there amber may become quite comprehensible to you, I must add that amber is one of those 7 planetary formations, in the arising of which the omnipresent active element Okitanoch takes part, with all its 3 separate, independent, sacred parts, in equal proportion. And in the process of planetary actualization, these intraplanetary and surplanetary formations serve for what is called the impeding of the independent flow of these 3 localized, independent, sacred parts. At this point of his tale, Beelzebub made a short pause, as if he were thinking about something, and afterwards continued thus. During my narration of what I then saw on a still surviving terra firma part of the surface of your planet among the 3-brained beings there, certain of whom were the direct descendants of members of the truly great learned society Akalan there, the result of the manifestations of my being reason was that, owing to various associative recollections of all kinds of impressions, of the perceptions, of the visibility of the exterior environment of the said region, which have become fixed in my common presence, there have been gradually revived in me all the scenes and all the associative flow of thoughts of one of these being experiencings of mine, which occurred during my last stay there on my visit, just to that same contemporary Egypt, when I once sat absorbed in thought at the foot of one of these constructions, which had chanced to survive from that period, and which is now called their pyramids. It was just then that in the general function of my reason there was also associated, among other things, the following. Good. If none of the benefits already formally attained by the reason of the beings of the continent Atlantis for ordinary being existence has become the possession of the contemporary beings of this planet, then this might perhaps be logically explained simply because, for cosmic reasons, not issuing at all from and not depending upon the 3-brained beings there, that second great cataclysm not according to law occurred, during which not only that continent itself perished, but also everything which existed on it. But this Egypt, was not its magnificence still quite recent? There is no denying it. Owing to the 3rd small catastrophe to that ill-fated planet, and also to the 5th, about which I shall speak later, this part also of its surface, it is true, suffered, having been covered with sands. Nevertheless, the 3-brained beings dwelling there did not perish, but were only scattered over various other parts of the same continent, and consequently whatever new exterior conditions may have ensued, there should have survived in their presences, it would seem, the crystallized results of the perfected factors transmitted to them by inheritance for normal being logical mentation. And so, my boy, being desirous after this distressful alstuzori of mine, or as your favorites would say, sorrowful reflections, to clear up for myself the very essence of the cause also of this lamentable fact there, I understood at the end of my minute investigations, and became aware with all my being, that this abnormality there proceeds exclusively owing only to one remarkable aspect of the chief particularity of their strange psyche, namely, that particularity which has become completely crystallized and is an inseparable part of their common presences, and which serves as a factor for the periodic arising in them of what is called the urgent need to destroy everything outside of themselves. The point is that when, during the apogee of the development of such a peculiarity, terrifying to every reason, of the psyche of the three-brained beings, they began to manifest outside of themselves this phenomenal peculiarity of their common presences, that is to say, when they begin to carry out on some part of the surface of their planet the process of reciprocal destruction, then at the same time, without any deliberate aim, and even without what is called organic need, they also destroy everything which chances to come within the sphere of the perception of their organ of sight. During the periods of this phenomenal psychopathic apogee, they destroy also all the objects of the given place, and at the given time, which these same beings themselves, between whom this terrifying process proceeds, have intentionally produced, as well as the productions which have chanced to survive and to reach them from the beings of previous epochs. Well then, my boy, at the period of the fourth sojourn of mine in person on the surface of your planet, I first arrived in the country now called Egypt, and after having stayed there a few days among the remote descendants of the members of the great learned society Akalan, and becoming acquainted with certain surviving results of their being partikdog duty for the welfare of their descendants, I afterwards, accompanied by 2 of our tribe, went to the southern countries of the same continent, and there, with the help of the local three-brained beings, caught the necessary number of ape beings. Having accomplished this, I telepathically signaled our ship Occasion, which descended to us, it must be said, on the first very dark night. And when we had loaded these ape beings into the special section of the ship Occasion, which had been constructed for Gunahur Harhark under his directions, we at once reascended to the planet Mars. And 3 Martian days later, on the same ship, and together with these apes, I ascended to the planet Saturn. Though we had previously decided to carry out the experiments with these apes only on the following year, when they would have become thoroughly acclimatized and orientated to existence under the new conditions, I ascended to the planet Saturn so soon because at my last personal meeting with Gornahur Harhark, I had promised him to be present at his family solemnity, which had soon to take place. And this family solemnity of Gornahur Harhark's was that beings like himself around him were to consecrate the first heir produced by him. I promised to attend this family solemnity, Kri Khra Kri, in order to undertake, regarding his recently arisen heir, what is called the Alnaturornian being duty. Here it is interesting to remark that this kind of procedure for undertaking this being duty took place among the ancient three-brained beings of your planet also, and even reached your contemporary favorites, though these latter, just as in everything else, take only the external form of this serious and important procedure. The beings who undertake, as it were, these duties are called by your contemporary favorites godfathers and godmothers. The heir of Gornahor Harhach was then called Raur,